When I agreed to join my friend Max on his cross-country road trip, I never expected to find myself in the middle of the Utah desert late at night, the only light coming from the crescent moon and the faint glow of our car's dashboard. Max and I had always been city kids, and the vast emptiness of the desert was a stark, almost unnerving contrast to the noise and bustle we were used to. Our destination was Bryce Canyon, where we planned to camp under the stars. Max had insisted on taking the scenic route through Navajo territory, hoping to experience the untouched beauty of the land. However, as the miles stretched on and the GPS signal failed, scenic beauty was the last thing on my mind. Around midnight, we came across a lonely gas station, its flickering neon sign barely visible against the dark sky. Max pulled in to refuel, while I went inside to grab some snacks. The clerk behind the counter, an older Native American man, watched us with a wary gaze. As I paid for our items, he leaned forward slightly. "Where are you boys headed?" he asked. "To Bryce Canyon," I replied. "Taking the scenic route." His expression darkened. "Avoid the back roads tonight. Strange things happen out there." I nodded, trying to brush off the unease his words brought. But as I returned to the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something we didn't. Back on the road, Max was excitedly recounting stories of desert folklore, coyotes, lost travelers, and mysterious lights. I wasn't paying much attention until he mentioned skinwalkers. "They're Navajo witches, right?" I asked. Max nodded. "Shape shifters. They can take the form of animals, especially coyotes. The stories say they're evil, cursed souls." I rolled my eyes. About an hour later, the road narrowed into a single-lane dirt path, flanked by cliffs on one side and a steep drop on the other. Max insisted it was a shortcut, but I wasn't so sure. The car bumped and jolted over the uneven terrain, and the oppressive silence outside felt heavier with every passing minute. Then we saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by our high beams. At first, I thought it was a man, but as we drew closer, its features became harder to define. Its limbs were too long, its posture too rigid. Max slammed on the brakes, and the car skidded to a halt just a few feet away. The thing stared at us unblinking, its eyes reflecting the headlights like an animal's. Then it moved, jerky, unnatural movements, as it stepped to the side and disappeared into the darkness. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Max didn't answer. His hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. "We need to turn around," I said. Max shook his head. "It's just some weirdo trying to scare us. Let's keep going." Reluctantly, I agreed. But as we drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to dart just beyond the edges of the headlights, and strange howls echoed in the distance. They didn't sound like coyotes, or any animal I'd ever heard. The road finally opened into a small clearing where we decided to stop and gather our bearings. Max pulled out a map, trying to figure out where we'd gone wrong. Meanwhile, I stepped out of the car to stretch my legs. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the bushes. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned to see a pair of glowing eyes staring at me from the underbrush. "Max," I hissed, "get back in the car, now. Drive," I shouted, diving into the passenger seat. Max didn't need to be told twice. He floored the gas pedal, and the car lurched forward, tires kicking up dust as we sped away. The creature gave chase, its unnatural speed allowing it to keep up with us easily. I could hear its claws scraping against the car's rear bumper, Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it stopped. I turned to look out the back window and saw it standing in the middle of the road, watching us with those glowing eyes. We didn't stop until we reached the main highway, the gas station clerk's warning echoing in my mind. Even now, months later, I can't explain what we saw that night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never underestimate desert folklore again. The idea of exploring Skinwalker Ridge had always been a distant thrill for me. As a freelance journalist chasing supernatural stories, I considered myself brave, maybe even foolish. So, when a Navajo elder named Esther approached me with tales of Skinwalker sightings near her village, I couldn't resist. Esther's stories were vivid, of shadowy figures prowling the edges of the desert, of neighbors who vanished without a trace, and of eerie howls carried on the wind during full moons. Despite her warnings, I packed my camera, recorder, and a bag of supplies, determined to document the truth. By dusk, I was on the road, my car rumbling along the cracked asphalt leading to Skinwalker Ridge. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the desert. The air felt heavy, as if the land itself carried an ancient weight. The village where I was to meet Esther was small, a collection of scattered homes surrounded by miles of emptiness. She greeted me outside her modest home, her lined face set in a grim expression. "Are you sure about this, Alex?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "What you seek is dangerous. Skinwalkers are not legends to us. They are real, and they do not like outsiders." I nodded, feigning more confidence than I felt. "I'll be careful." She handed me a small pouch of herbs and a polished turquoise stone. "Keep these with you. They won't stop a skinwalker, but they might slow it down." With her parting warning heavy in my ears, I left the village and drove toward the ridge. The road soon turned into a dusty trail, flanked by jagged rock formations that loomed like silent sentinels. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light barely enough to illuminate the path ahead. I parked at the base of the ridge and stepped out into the cool night air. The stillness was unsettling. Even the usual desert sounds, crickets, the rustle of dry brush, were absent. I should have turned back, but curiosity propelled me forward. The climb was steep, the rocky terrain making progress slow. My flashlight beam danced across the uneven ground, revealing nothing but stones and sparse vegetation. Still, I felt it, that unnerving sensation of being watched. Halfway up the ridge, I set up my camera, aiming it toward the valley below. The view was breathtaking, but I couldn't shake the oppressive silence. As I adjusted the focus, a faint sound reached my ears, a distant howl that sent a chill down my spine. It was low and guttural, unlike anything I'd heard before. I froze, straining to pinpoint the source. The howl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something moving through the brush. My heart pounded as I swept my flashlight across the darkness. The beam landed on a pair of eyes reflecting the light, glowing and blinking. The creature stepped into view, and I felt my blood run cold. It was enormous, with matted fur and limbs that seemed to long for its body. Its face was grotesque, a horrifying blend of human and animal features. For a moment, we stared at each other, the air between us crackling with tension. Then it moved, lurching toward me with an unnatural speed. I grabbed my camera and bolted, my boots slipping on the loose rocks. The creature's snarls grew louder, its heavy footfalls closing the distance. Desperation fueled me as I scrambled down a ridge, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could see my car in the distance, but the creature was gaining on me. The sudden burst of smoke seemed to slow the creature, giving me precious seconds to reach the car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as the creature lunged at the window. Its claws raked the glass, leaving deep gouges. I started the engine and floored the accelerator, the tires kicking up dust as I sped away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the creature standing in the middle of the trail, its glowing eyes fixed on me. Even as I put miles between us, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching, waiting. Back in the village, Esther listened silently as I recounted my encounter. When I finished, she placed a hand on my shoulder. "You were lucky," she said. "Skinwalkers don't let most people leave." I left Skinwalker Ridge the next morning, my footage untouched. Some stories, I realized, are better left untold. When the opportunity arose to take a break from my city life, I jumped at it. My cousin Mark owned a cabin deep in the woods of Pine Creek, a place he'd long raved about for its tranquility. After years of hearing his stories, I finally decided to visit for a much-needed escape. What I didn't know was that Pine Creek had its own stories, ones that were far darker and more terrifying than Mark had ever let on. The drive to the cabin was long, winding through dense forest that grew more impenetrable the deeper I went. By the time I arrived, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was a modest structure, its wooden exterior weathered by years of exposure to the elements. Mark had stocked the place with essentials before heading out of town, leaving me a note that read, "Enjoy the peace and quiet, but don't wander too far after dark." I laughed it off, thinking it was just his way of teasing me about being a city slicker unaccustomed to rural life. The first evening passed uneventfully. I sat on the porch with a mug of tea, listening to the soothing sounds of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It felt good to disconnect from the constant hum of city life. As night fell, I retreated inside, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and settled into a worn leather armchair with a book. The serenity was short-lived. Around midnight, a sound jolted me awake. I dozed off, the book slipping from my hands to the floor. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from just outside the cabin. I froze, my pulse quickening. The growl came again, this time closer. Grabbing the flashlight from the coffee table, I crept to the window and peered out. The beam of light sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. Still, the feeling of being watched prickled at the back of my neck. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a coyote or maybe a bear. But deep down, I knew it was something else. The growl didn't sound like it belonged to any creature I'd ever heard. The next day, I decided to explore the woods. Maybe walking the trails would help shake off the unease from the night before. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden streams. Birds chirped, and squirrels darted between the trees. I followed a narrow path that led to a small creek, its clear water bubbling over smooth stones. As I knelt to refill my water bottle, I noticed something odd. On the muddy bank of the creek were tracks, large, clawed, and unlike anything I'd seen before. They looked almost canine, but were far too big. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the growl from the night before. I hurried back to the cabin, my earlier sense of peace replaced by a growing unease. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I barricaded the door and windows, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. Nightfall brought a silence that was almost oppressive. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, were absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. Then, just as the clock struck midnight, the growl came again. This time, it was accompanied by the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin. My heart pounded as I grabbed the shotgun Mark had left in the corner, praying I wouldn't have to use it. The footsteps stopped, replaced by a scratching sound at the door. I aimed the flashlight at the door, the beam illuminating deep gouges in the wood. Whatever was out there was trying to get in. My hands trembled as I cocked the shotgun, the sound loud in the silence. "Go away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a deep, guttural snarl erupted from the other side of the door, shaking the cabin to its foundations. I fired a shot through the door, the blast ringing in my ears. The snarling ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. I didn't sleep that night, clutching the shotgun as I sat in the corner, my eyes fixed on the door. When dawn finally broke, I cautiously stepped outside. The clearing was empty, but the ground was littered with massive footprints leading into the forest. I packed my things and left that morning, my so-called peaceful retreat cut short. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I told Mark about my experience, he grew pale. "You saw it," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The guardian of Pine Creek." He went on to explain that locals believed the forest was protected by a creature, part animal, part spirit, that kept intruders out. It didn't bother those who respected the land, but it didn't take kindly to outsiders. I never went back to Pine Creek, and to this day, the memory of that growl haunts me. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was something ancient, something that belonged to the forest in a way I never could. The night I decided to venture into the heart of Silver Ridge Forest is one I'll never forget. My name is Liam Morris, and I work as a wildlife researcher specializing in tracking elusive predators. My work had brought me to this dense, sprawling woodland on the edge of a rural town, where locals spoke in hushed tones about strange sightings and unearthly howls. The forest was rumored to be the territory of a mysterious creature, often described as part wolf, part human. Most called it a myth, but the more superstitious among the townsfolk believed it to be a werewolf. I wasn't one to believe in such tales, but I was curious, too curious. I arrived at Silver Ridge during the late afternoon, the sun casting golden light over the trees. My objective was clear: to set up motion, activated cameras, and collect data on the wildlife. The forest felt alive, every sound and movement a testament to its untamed beauty. I had done similar research in countless forests, but something about Silver Ridge felt different. It wasn't just the tales, it was the atmosphere, a heavy, oppressive stillness beneath the surface. As the sun dipped lower, I reached a clearing where I planned to set up camp. I pitched my tent, placed my cameras at strategic locations, and prepared for a night of monitoring. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The cheerful chirping of birds gave way to the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Around midnight, the stillness became unnerving. I sat by the fire, listening to the forest, when a sound broke through the silence, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My heart skipped a beat as I instinctively reached for my flashlight. Sweeping the beam through the darkness, I saw nothing but trees and shadows. Still, the growl stayed with me, reverberating in my chest. I convinced myself it was a wolf or a coyote and decided to retreat to the tent. But sleep was elusive. Every rustle, every crackle of leaves outside made me jump. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, circling the tent. I held my breath, clutching the knife I always kept nearby, but eventually, the sounds faded. The next morning, I found tracks around the campsite. They were massive, almost like a wolf's, but far larger, and with an unsettling, almost human-like structure. The claw marks were deep, and the distance between the prints suggested something that walked upright. Despite my fear, my curiosity won. I decided to follow the tracks deeper into the forest, armed with my camera and field notebook. The trail led me through dense underbrush, past towering pines and gnarled oaks. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. It was as if the usual inhabitants, the birds, the squirrels, the deer, had vanished. By mid-afternoon, I stumbled upon something unexpected, a clearing littered with the remains of animals. Bones, stripped of flesh, lay scattered around, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. At the center was a large, clawed imprint in the ground, as if the creature had marked its territory. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just an animal's den. It was something far more sinister. I quickly took photographs and notes before retreating. But as I made my way back, the forest seemed to close in on me. Shadows lengthened, and every sound felt amplified. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I quickened my pace, but the sense of unease only grew. As dusk fell, I reached my campsite, but it no longer felt like a refuge. The tracks I'd followed earlier now surrounded the area, as if the creature had returned while I was gone. The firewood I had collected was scattered, and the tent's fabric bore long, jagged tears. Panic set in. I knew I couldn't stay another night. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, the sound of my own breathing loud in my ears. Just as I was about to leave, the growl returned, this time much closer. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly, I turned to face the forest. Two glowing eyes stared back at me from the darkness, reflecting the dying light of the fire. The creature stepped into view, and my blood ran cold. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a muscular, humanoid frame covered in coarse, dark fur. Its head was wolf-like, with a long snout and sharp, glistening teeth. But its eyes, they weren't those of an animal. They held an intelligence that sent shivers down my spine. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then, it let out a deafening roar, and I bolted. I ran blindly through the forest, the creature's heavy footsteps pounding behind me. Branches tore at my clothes, and the uneven terrain threatened to trip me, but adrenaline kept me moving. Somehow, I made it to my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling as I unlocked the door and jumped inside. The engine roared to life, and I sped away, the creature's howls echoing in the distance. When I reached the safety of the town, I collapsed into a chair at the local diner, my mind racing. The waitress, A kind-faced woman named Nancy noticed my disheveled state and asked what had happened. When I hesitantly described the creature, her face paled. "You've seen it," she whispered. "The beast of Silver Ridge." She explained that the locals had long believed in the creature, a guardian of the forest that emerged to ward off intruders. It wasn't evil, she said, but it was fiercely territorial. I never returned to Silver Ridge. The photographs and notes I'd taken remained locked away, reminders of an encounter I couldn't fully explain. To this day, I wonder if the creature was a warning, a guardian protecting its domain. Whatever it was, it taught me that some mysteries are better left undisturbed. My name is Ethan Grayson, and I was a park ranger stationed at Pine Hollow National Park, a sprawling forest that seemed endless under the vast sky. My job was straightforward: patrol the area, ensure visitors followed the rules, and keep an eye on the wildlife. It was a solitary life, but I enjoyed the peace that came with the isolation. At least, I used to. Pine Hollow wasn't just any forest. It had a reputation among the locals, whispered tales of strange sightings and unsettling noises. They called it the Whispering Woods. I always chalked it up to folklore, stories to keep kids from wandering too far or to entertain campers around a fire. But one night, I learned there was more to the forest than I'd ever imagined. It was mid-October when I was assigned to monitor the northern sector of the park, a less traveled area dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. A storm was brewing that evening, the air heavy with the promise of rain, but my instructions were clear: inspect the area for any signs of poachers. A recent string of illegal hunting incidents had put the park on high alert. I set out just before sunset, my flashlight and radio at my side. The first hour was uneventful, the usual rustle of leaves and distant calls of wildlife my only company. As night fell, the storm rolled in. The first crack of thunder startled me, and soon rain began to pour in sheets, turning the dirt trails into muddy streams. It wasn't long before the forest felt different. The usual night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of small animals, faded, replaced by an eerie silence. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only rain, soaked foliage, and the occasional reflective eyes of startled deer. Still, the unease grew. About an hour into my patrol, I stumbled across something odd. A series of claw marks gouged deep into the trunk of a tree. They were fresh, the bark splintered and raw. I crouched to examine them, the size and depth unlike anything I'd seen before. No bear or mountain lion could have done this. The marks were spaced apart in a way that suggested a hand, not a paw. A shiver ran down my spine. I radioed the ranger station, but the storm interfered with the signal. Static crackled in my ear, and my calls went unanswered. Frustrated, I decided to mark the location on my map and continue the patrol. But as I turned to leave, a sound stopped me in my tracks, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant. It wasn't far, but it wasn't close either, echoing through the trees like a warning. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the rain and darkness swallowed the beam. My pulse quickened as I scanned the area, every shadow and movement setting my nerves on edge. Then I saw it, two glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. They were too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, and too focused, too intelligent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The eyes blinked, then vanished as if the creature had melted into the shadows. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but my training held me back. I had a duty to investigate. Swallowing my fear, I followed the direction of the eyes, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The trail led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew closer together, their gnarled branches twisting like claws. The rain intensified, the thunder rumbling so loud it seemed to shake the ground. My boots squelched in the mud as I pushed forward, the growls growing louder and more frequent. Finally, I reached a clearing. At the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin I had never seen on any park map. Its roof sagged under the weight of moss, and the windows were dark, shattered remnants of glass framing the void inside. I hesitated, every fiber of my being telling me to turn back. But then I heard it, a voice, faint and distorted, calling my name. Ethan. My heart pounded as I spun around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The voice came again, this time from the cabin. It was impossible, unnatural, as if someone was speaking from underwater. Against my better judgment, I approached the cabin, each step feeling like a descent into madness. The door hung ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind blew. I stepped inside, the wooden floor groaning under my weight. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. My flashlight revealed a room filled with broken furniture and strange markings etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize, carved deep into the wood. As I scanned the room, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Swinging the flashlight, I saw a figure crouched in the corner. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. Its head snapped up, revealing a face half covered in matted fur, with eyes that burned like embers. The creature let out a guttural snarl and lunged toward me. I stumbled back, my flashlight falling to the floor as I scrambled to escape. The thing's claws raked the air where I had stood moments before, and its inhuman scream echoed in my ears. I bolted out of the cabin, my boots slipping on the wet ground as I ran blindly through the forest. The creature gave chase, its heavy footsteps and guttural growls closing in. Branches whipped at my face, the rain blinding me, but I didn't dare stop. Somehow, I reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My colleagues found me hours later, drenched and trembling, clutching a knife I had grabbed from the supply cabinet. I tried to explain what happened, but they chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. I left Pine Hollow shortly after that. The park remains open, but I wonder how many others have encountered what lurks in those woods. The locals still speak of the Whispering Woods, but now I know the truth. Some legends are born from reality, and some creatures should never be disturbed.